Monetary systems rarely fail through collapse, they fail through redefinition. A promise is altered, a constraint removed, and continuity is preserved by shifting cost forward. The public experience is calm. Markets open the next day. Transactions continue. Only later does the significance become clear. Reality has been loosened. In the early 1970s, the global monetary order rested on a simple limitation. Currency expansion was anchored to an external reference. That anchor did not eliminate cycles, but it imposed discipline. It constrained how much imbalance could accumulate before correction occurred. When that constraint was removed, it was described not as an ending, but as a pause. The announcement was brief, procedural, and reassuring. A temporary adjustment, a technical necessity, stability promised. What actually occurred was a structural shift. Money ceased to be a claim on something finite and became a claim on future credibility. The system did not break. It adapted. And in adapting, it changed who absorbed cost and when. This moment is often framed as political theater, but its significance was mechanical. Once convertibility ended, there was no external measure enforcing restraint. Expansion became endogenous. Governments could finance deficits without immediate settlement. Debt no longer demanded resolution. It demanded rollover. This did not feel like inflationary policy at first. It felt like flexibility. What followed was not immediate crisis, but drift. Prices began to rise unevenly. Wages lagged. Productivity struggled to keep pace with monetary growth. The result was a condition previously considered unlikely: stagnation alongside inflation. Traditional tools failed because the problem was not cyclical, it was structural. Money had been redefined without a replacement constraint. The social cost emerged slowly. Savings lost purchasing power quietly. Fixed incomes eroded without formal taxation. Asset holders adapted faster than wage earners. This was not redistribution by intent. It was redistribution by arithmetic. When money expands faster than output, those closest to issuance adjust first. Others absorb the difference over time. The key mistake was not dishonesty or secrecy, it was permanence. A temporary measure became the new baseline. Systems recalibrated around it. International trade adjusted. Financial markets expanded to intermediate the growing gap between promises and production. Debt replaced settlement. Confidence replaced convertibility. Midway through this analysis, pause briefly. If you find value in examining monetary history as infrastructure rather than rhetoric, consider subscribing and leaving a short comment. Not to react, but to mark that this way of understanding still matters. Once the anchor was gone, discipline migrated from currency to institutions. Central banks became managers of expectation rather than custodians of limitation. Interest rates replaced convertibility as the primary tool. This worked only as long as credibility held. When it wavered, policy became reactive. Inflation was treated as transitory because acknowledging structure would have required reversal. What is often overlooked is that this transition solved an immediate problem. It allowed governments to meet obligations without default. It preserved continuity during stress. Finance enabled survival when political consent was thin. This is why the system endured. It absorbed cost rather than confronting it. But absorption has limits. Costs deferred do not disappear. They accumulate. They manifest later as volatility, inequality, and repeated intervention. Each cycle requires larger measures to achieve the same effect. This is not failure. It is escalation. The relevance today lies not in repetition of events, but in repetition of logic. When systems detach money from constraint to preserve stability, they trade immediacy for accumulation. The bill does not arrive quickly. It arrives comprehensively. Once money became unbound from external reference, a second transformation followed. Debt changed character. It ceased to be a temporary bridge between production and payment and became a permanent feature of governance. Borrowing no longer signaled exception. It signaled normal operation. States learned that obligations could be rolled forward indefinitely, as long as confidence remained intact. This altered incentives at every level. Fiscal decisions no longer required immediate trade-offs. Costs could be postponed. Political systems adapted quickly to this flexibility. Programs expanded without corresponding taxation. Deficits lost their stigma. What mattered was not balance, but manageability. As long as markets absorbed issuance, the system appeared stable. The private sector followed the same logic. Credit expansion substituted for wage growth. Consumption was sustained not by productivity alone, but by borrowing against future income. This masked stagnation. Living standards appeared resilient, even as underlying capacity weakened. The economy did not shrink, it stretched. This stretching produced a specific pathology. Inflation no longer surged uniformly. It appeared in waves and pockets. Asset prices rose faster than goods. Financial assets adjusted first, labor adjusted last. Inequality widened not through policy, but through sequencing. Those closest to financial channels adapted early. Others lagged behind rising costs. Central banks became the primary stabilizers of this arrangement. Their role shifted from enforcing limits to managing expectations. Inflation targets replaced convertibility. Interest rates replaced settlement. This worked only because credibility substituted for constraint. Markets believed intervention would arrive before disorder. That belief became self-reinforcing. But credibility is not infinite. It is cumulative and fragile. Each intervention expands the scale required for the next. Small adjustments lose effect. Larger measures become necessary to maintain the same outcome. This is not recklessness. It is escalation built into the system. The 1970s revealed one boundary of this process. When inflation and stagnation appeared together, traditional tools conflicted. Tightening suppressed growth. Loosening fueled prices. Policymakers faced a dilemma not because of incompetence, but because the structure allowed incompatible outcomes to coexist. Money could expand, but real capacity could not respond quickly enough. Over time, new mechanisms were introduced to contain these tensions. Financial innovation absorbed volatility. Globalization dispersed cost. Demographics temporarily offset imbalance. Each solution preserved continuity by pushing adjustment outward in space or forward in time. None restored the original constraint. This is how systems persist beyond their design. They accumulate layers. Each layer addresses a symptom without revisiting foundation. The result is resilience without simplicity. Stability becomes conditional on constant intervention. Absence of crisis requires effort, not balance. The relevance of this history today lies in the recurrence of its signals. Rising debt alongside slowing productivity. Asset inflation outpacing wages. Policy described as temporary but repeated. Confidence invoked as a substitute for settlement. These are not predictions. They are structural echoes. As debt grows relative to output, the margin for error narrows. Servicing costs absorb fiscal capacity. Policy becomes reactive. Choices compress. At a certain scale, stability itself becomes the objective rather than growth or renewal. Preservation replaces progress. This does not imply imminent collapse. Systems rarely end that way. They adapt by redefining normal. Higher inflation becomes acceptable. Lower growth becomes tolerable. Intervention becomes permanent. The system survives by lowering expectations. This section clarifies the pattern. The mistake was not made once. It was institutionalized. A temporary suspension became an operating principle. Each decade built upon it. The cost was not paid immediately. It was distributed gradually, invisibly, and unevenly. Understanding this is not about alarm. It is about orientation. When money loses constraint, discipline migrates elsewhere. And wherever it migrates, someone absorbs the cost. When a monetary system survives long enough without constraint, it begins to confuse continuity with sustainability. The distinction is subtle but decisive. Continuity means the system keeps operating. Sustainability means it can do so without escalating intervention. The post-1971 order mastered the first. It postponed the second. As debt accumulates, policy space narrows. Servicing existing obligations consumes fiscal capacity that could otherwise support adaptation. Growth becomes desirable not for prosperity, but for solvency. When growth slows, authorities face a familiar dilemma: accept contraction or extend balance sheets further. In practice, extension dominates. Systems evolve to absorb cost rather than confront it. This absorption reshapes behavior. Markets learn to expect intervention. Risk pricing adapts accordingly. What once required caution becomes normalized. The boundary between emergency and routine blurs. Extraordinary measures repeat until they are no longer extraordinary. Stability is maintained, but only through increasing effort. Over time, this creates a dependency cycle. Each period of stress requires larger responses to achieve the same calming effect. The marginal impact of policy declines. Credibility is preserved through scale rather than restraint. This does not imply deception. It reflects the logic of a system without an anchor. When there is no external limit, internal limits must be negotiated continuously. The long-term consequence is not immediate crisis, but fragility. The system becomes sensitive to shocks it once absorbed easily. Small disruptions propagate because buffers are thinner. Debt levels restrict flexibility. Demographic shifts compound the strain. None of these forces are catastrophic alone. Together, they compress choice. The relevance of this history to the present lies in pattern, not prophecy. Rising public obligations alongside slowing productivity. Asset values supported by policy rather than income. Reassurances framed as temporary while becoming structural. These signals do not predict a specific outcome. They indicate a familiar phase. In such phases, the question is rarely whether adjustment will occur, but how it will be distributed. Inflation is one method. Financial repression is another. Currency depreciation, whether overt or gradual, is a third. Each preserves continuity by reallocating cost. Each does so unevenly. What is often described as a coming reset is better understood as recalibration. Systems rarely admit failure. They redefine normal. Higher baseline inflation becomes acceptable. Lower real returns become standard. Intervention becomes permanent infrastructure. The system survives by changing expectations rather than structure. This is why the language of warning persists across decades. Each generation encounters the same tension in different form. The anchor removed in one era is replaced by a tool in the next. The tool grows heavier as the system ages. Eventually, the tool becomes the structure. The 1970s demonstrated one boundary of this approach. Later decades extended it through globalization, financialization, and demographic tailwinds. As those supports weaken, the underlying question returns: how much flexibility remains when constraint has been deferred for so long? History does not suggest inevitability. It suggests trade-offs. Monetary freedom buys time. Time accumulates cost. The longer adjustment is postponed, the more distributed and opaque it becomes. This is not a judgment. It is an accounting identity applied at scale. Money is infrastructure. When its design changes, societies reorganize around the new load paths. Some adapt quickly. Others absorb stress quietly. Power follows endurance because endurance preserves optionality when systems tighten. The mistake no one talks about was not a single decision. It was the belief that removing a constraint without replacing its function would remain neutral over time. The system endured. That endurance carried a price. History explains the present without blaming it. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look. You can change this.